Thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Ledbury. I'm the director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, and I'm really glad you could all make it here for another lecture in our Sydney Asian Art series. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of this land, the land on which the University of Sydney's campuses are built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's on their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and it is to their maybe 50,000-year-old tradition of teaching and learning that on which we reflect as we teach and go about our business in the University of Sydney. I'd also like to thank the many partners that make the Sydney Asian Art series possible. Here at the University of Sydney, the China Studies Centre and Sydney Ideas. Beyond the University of Sydney, Visasia and the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who have combined in an exemplary way to make sure we have an entertaining 4-speaker series that runs all year, and also extra events. Some of you might have been at Ajay's introduction, Bombay Talkies, on Wednesday last, and we've had the great pleasure too of hosting Ajay's partner Mimi Hellman, a distinguished scholar of the 18th century and pedagogical leader in her own right, and that's all been amazing fun, and it's been a very great pleasure. I also wish to thank everyone at Power who's helped to make this work. That's Isabel Hall-Thorburn, now sadly departed for Berlin, Katie Uclea, and Ira Ferris for all of the work they've done to help make Ajay and Mimi's stay here a happy one. And I would also like to thank Susan Thomas for everything she continues to do. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that there will be another 2, that we're winding down for this semester, but there will be more. There's more next semester, both in the Sydney Asian Arts series, with Tymon Screech and Nancy coming, and there's also an exciting event in our Keir lecture series. Stephen Nelson, a very distinguished historian not only of African art, but of African American art and experience, is coming in August. Please watch this space. It's my pleasure, though, tonight to introduce Ajay Sinha, a historian of South Asian art and architecture and visual culture, who is a professor of art history and chair of the art history department at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. He was first trained at the University of Baroda in India, then took his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and his published work focuses first on the history of architecture in South Asia, and his book, Imagining Architects' Creativity in the Religious Monuments of India, was, it's kind of been like the first iteration of his mold-breaking career, really, an innovative study of Visara monuments from the 10th to the 12th centuries, making an argument that there were real, not anonymous, individual architects who had agency and productivity. It was itself a groundbreaking study, and that, along with major articles in the journals that lead the field, established him as a thorough and innovative scholar of South Asian architecture, but in parallel, he's shown himself to be a considerable scholar of 20th century Asian art and visual culture. In articles including one that for the field's very important, a dialogue with Partha Mitter in Art Bulletin, and in many other places, Ajay demonstrated not only a thorough archival and scholarly knowledge of fields that aren't that well known to many of the major institutions of art history, but also his thorough theoretical understanding of the stakes of colonial modernism and of post-colonial conundrums writ large. He's also co-edited a volume on one of the most important of all manifestations of South Asian visual culture in the last century. It's a long history, and the volume is called Bollyworld, Popular Indian Cinema Through a Transnational Lens, exploring a very long and deep history of Indian cinema as transnational phenomenon. And that same interest in the complexity of transnational exchange, displacement, cross-cultural and complicated mutual fascination is at the heart of his new project, about which we're going to hear more tonight, as he explores at book length the ramifications of a group of over 100 photographs of an Indian dancer, Gopal, taken in New York City by the American photographer Carl van Vechten in the early 20th century. And that, indeed, is the title of his talk tonight, Transcultural Attractions, Photographs of an Indian Dancer. Please welcome Ajay Sinha.
Well, that was a stunning introduction. Thank you, Mark. It is it's very generous. After I'll live up to that. I want to especially thank Mark Ledbury, Power Professor of Fine Arts and Visual Culture and the Director of the Power Institute, for making the Institute our primary host, both for me and my wife, Mimi Hellman, art historian at Skidmore, as Mark mentioned. Let me see if I can hear it. And I also wanted to add my thanks to the various wonderful staff that has made this trip for both of us such a pleasurable experience. Isabel Thorburn, who started the whole arrangement process, and Katie Uglea and Ira Fares, who picked up the threads and made all this possible for both of us, including the lecture tonight. Also, there are so many people in the Fine Arts and Visual Culture group, the museum here at the university, the Art Institute at New South Wales, and colleagues that we've had wonderful conversations in the last week or so here, 10 days or so. So thank you all for making this really a stimulating visit for us in Sydney. I also thank Ruby Arrowsmith Todd at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for her contribution to this visit, and including the invitation to the film screening of Bombay Talkies last week as part of the Sydney Asian Art series. And above all, I want to thank Stephen Whiteman, lecturer in Asian art at the University of Sydney, who couldn't be with us because he's traveling, which just goes to suggest the global reach of this institution, but who invited me to participate in this visionary and wonderful Sydney Asian Art Lecture Series. And I know the series is made possible by a whole group of institutions: the China Studies Center, the Power Institute, the Viz Art, the support of the Asian Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Sydney Ideas at the university, and so forth. So I want to add my own thanks to make that you all have made this possible. So Stephen Whiteman's being the primary visionary of this Asian art lecture series, and the topic of the series for 2018 is Uncertain Objects, Trajectories of Asian Art. And it is in this context that I want to share with you this evening a story of discovery and puzzlement about one such uncertain object. About 4 years ago, I was invited to participate in a seminar on South Asian photography at the Yale University in the US. And the seminar brought together an international group of scholars to assess what seemed to the organizers a new and emerging area of interest, and to evaluate their rather large collection of South Asian photography in the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts library. And as I was snooping around in the Beinecke between sessions, I chanced upon a cache of over 100 large format photographs mounted on boards that completely stopped me in my tracks. The catalog entry indicated that the photographs were of an Indian dancer named Gopal, and that they were taken by an American photographer named Carl Van Vechten in the spring of 1938. Given the context of the Yale seminar where I was participating, I assumed that the images would have been taken in India. Most of the photographs that were shown to us on a regular basis at the Beinecke Library were indeed taken by American tourists visiting India in the early 20th century, when tourism blossomed when ships that were abandoned after World War I were repurposed for sort of global American tourism. Of course, there was nationalistic movement in India that brought in a lot of journalists from all over the world. So I thought all this set of photographs were happening in India in the context of this kind of travel and tourism. I was surprised, therefore, to learn that the photographs were not from India, but rather taken in Van Vechten's apartment studio in New York City. The images remained unknown and unpublished at the Beinecke, in part because they were also not catalogued under South Asian photography, but under the Yale Collection of American Literature, with which Carl Van Vechten was identified. The Yale photographs obviously slipped through the categories of genre and region in the library's catalog system, and thus became an uncertain object for me. This evening, I share with you my fascination with these images. Their uncertainty takes me outside my own expertise as a historian of South Asian art. The subject we see in the images is Indian, but the American photographer complicates the story. The dancer takes a range of dance poses in front of the camera, while the photographer adjusts the distance between the camera and the figure and frames the body tightly in half and full-length photographs. Matched backdrops and different lighting arrangements indicate deliberate staging, as in a commercial photo studio. But neither was Van Vechten a commercial photographer, nor Ram Gopal his client. The photo shoot in New York City appears to be nothing more than a private sport in which both the American photographer and the Indian dancer freely indulge. The photographs remained in Van Vechten's possession until the 1950s, when he gave them to the Yale University as part of his extensive archives. How to make sense of these images so thoroughly as they were immersed in transcultural interactions? Given their uncertainty within the categories of national and regional cultures, I suggest that we start by examining the photographs themselves as the primary site of cultural production. The photographs make one thing clear: both the dancer standing in front of the camera and the photographer standing behind the camera were actively manipulating the image during the photo shoot. Therefore, I begin my investigation by asking, what is the dancer showing to the camera? What is the photographer seeing from the other side of the lens? And finally, what is the role of the camera in this exchange between the dancer's self-presentation and the photographer's gaze? I admit I did not know anything about Ram Gopal or Van Vechten when I encountered these images. I now learn that both were significant figures in their separate domains in the 1930s. Let me introduce the dancer first. Ram Gopal was a major exponent and advocate of a reform and reinvention of dance taking place in India in the 1930s. He was also one of the few dancers of his time to take the mission of Indian dance abroad to Europe and the United States. Of a mixed Burmese and Rajput parentage, Ram Gopal grew up as a young dancer in Bangalore in 1930s. His autobiography, published in 1957, describes a passionate interest in dance since childhood. As a young boy, he was patronized by the Maharaja of Mysore to study a narrative form of temple dance called the Kathakali. He also learned the Kathak, a form of North Indian dance whose presence in the South Indian city of Bangalore suggests a cosmopolitan dance culture emerging in India in the 30s. Bangalore's dance culture grew out of a pan-Indian movement to reform and modernize dance for the urban public. The movement first began in the colonial city of Madras, and the primary model was the Bharatanatyam, a performance style developed for the modern proscenium stage in the 1930s, but which was named after the 6th century Sanskrit treatise on the arts called the Natya Shastra of by the sage Bharata. Bharatanatyam was designed to counteract a 19th century dance called sadir or nach, performed for local royalty and temples by women called devadasis, or the slaves to the gods. These were the dancing girls or temple prostitutes of 19th century British accounts, prohibited by law, but whose picture postcards circulated widely across the British Empire. Bharatanatyam was a conscious attempt to reform and modernize temple dance. It gained momentum in the 1930s at the intersection of a number of socio-political movements. One, feminist activism in Madras against the exploitation of young girls who were married to the temple and trained to perform erotic dance for a decadent royalty. Second, the dance reform was also inspired by nationalistic struggles against the British colonial rule, in which cultural authenticity became a new value around which an independent sovereign nation could be imagined. And finally, Bharatanatyam emerged through the efforts of educated urban middle class to retrieve and refine the formal aspects of dance against the recent corruption by tracing Bharatanatyam back to ancient Sanskrit texts and Hindu temple sculpture. The Bharatanatyam experiment resulted in what Uttara Asha Purlawala calls, quote, the Sanskritization of the dancing body. It was a new self-awareness of the dancer's reformed body emerging within the cosmopolitan cultures of Madras and Bangalore. So, when Ram Gopal takes a pose in front of Van Vechten's camera, he represents a Sanskritized body, a national body text of sorts shaped by dance reform. Ram Gopal's relationship to the nationalistic body text, however, is complicated, and the complications unfold not in India, but in New York City, a topic to which I want to turn now. In the spring of 1938, when Ram Gopal visited New York, he arrived in a city comparable to Bangalore, a city of literary figures, art critics, and connoisseurs of theater, film, dance, and music. At least that is the New York Ram Gopal encountered when he came in contact with the American photographer. By the 1930s, Carl Van Vechten was known as a prominent patron of African American musicians and performers of the jazz age, as well as a promoter of writers who shaped an artistic culture in New York known as the Harlem Renaissance. Decades earlier, around 1900s, Van Vechten began a career in New York City as a writer for the New York Times and was appointed in 1908 as a Paris correspondent to report on the arts. He also contributed to the Vanity Fair and other literary and lifestyle magazines, and distinguished himself by covering an unusually wide range from the Russian ballet and modern dance to advocating for African American club dance, the spirituals, and the blues music. Van Vechten actively promoted Black literary and artistic culture among white socialites in New York. To friends, he also introduced the Harlem as a place for commercial entertainment and sexual encounters. His own erotic relations with black men were well known, and his 1926 novel titled The Nigger Heaven became controversial in Harlem's African American community because it was closely based on his intimacy with the speakeasies and the club scenes of Harlem and his not so hidden interracial sexual interests. In 1932, Van Vechten acquired a Leica camera and converted his Midtown apartment into a photo studio, producing a remarkable collection of portraits of local and visiting people in the arts. A more private aspect of his practice included images of nude men, black and white, and scrapbooks of collages that turned photographs and mainstream media clippings into homoerotic innuendos. And so I ask, what happens when Van Vechten's racialized fascination turns on the Indian dancer? The answer lies somewhere in the history of global networks that brought the seemingly two different cultures of India and the US into contact with each other in early 20th century. That global history is encapsulated in a New York Times review of Ram Gopal's debut performance at the 46th Street Theater in New York on May the 1st, 1938. In that review, the critic, John Martin, describes the dancer as, quote, a slender, pictorial young man who does not look the 22 years accredited to him. The peculiar phrase, pictorial young man, not only points to Ram Gopal's visual appearance, but also describes the pictorial imagination of his American viewers. Let me elaborate on that imagination by relating it broadly to a transatlantic culture of writers, dancers, artists, and photographers who traveled between Europe and America between the two world wars. Whitney Chadwick describes the pictorial imagination best in a photograph by the American photographer Man Ray, published in 1926 in the French edition of the fashion magazine The Vogue. There, the visual juxtaposition of a disembodied head of a white woman and an African-American mask combines aesthetic and racial interests into what Chadwick calls a modernist gaze, one that simultaneously exoticizes female sexuality and eroticizes race through formal experiments designed for an urban consumer culture. The modernist gaze also informs the pictorial interests of the New York Times critic as well as Van Vechten. Van Vechten's photographs often derive directly from Man Ray, with only one difference. They resist the heterosexual fantasy of racial and sexual otherness on which Man Ray's disembodied fetish is based. Instead, Van Vechten creates a pictorial space in his studio, complete with props and backdrops comparable to a commercial photo studio, and invites men and women, black and white, to step in front of the camera and perform a fantasy of mirrored identities. In other words, Van Vechten wears modernism lightly. Instead of the edgy, formal experiments of professional photographers, he stages what Peter Wallen has called lifestyle modernism, a performance of selfhood using modernist fantasies from lifestyle and fashion magazines such as The Vogue and the Vanity Fair. Van Vechten's portrait by Romaine Brooks captures the global history of lifestyle modernism. Here, we see Van Vechten in a fashionable cream-colored suit gleaming against a dark curtain in which we faintly see faces of African-American men and women. On the left, a seascape with an ocean liner points to the transatlantic circuits that shaped Van Vechten's artistic practice. Notice a Leica camera in Van Vechten's right hand, not so much to identify him as a professional photographer, which he was not, but to make the German camera an attribute of his overall modernist lifestyle. The handheld camera was designed for serious amateurs, by which I mean a diverse group of people who pursued a professional ambition by choosing the expensive German machinery over many handheld cameras available in the market since 1888, when the Eastman Kodak company launched its first box camera for commercial use. The Kodak company company democratized photography through advertisements in which taking a photograph simply meant clicking the press button and sending away the camera to a Kodak center for developing, printing, and refill for future use. The Leica was different. Designed in the teens by an engineer named Oskar Barnack at the Ernst Leitz optical company in Wetzlar, Germany, the Leica was promoted as a technological adventure based on the company's reputation for making precision lenses for microscopes, telescopes, and the movie cameras. The Leica used a spool of 35mm film designed with perforations to originally engage the sprockets of a movie camera. The removable spool could be processed in a makeshift darkroom created in a home kitchen or a bathroom. Unlike the Kodak then, the Leica allowed photographers to control the entire process of image making, from loading the camera to making enlargements from negatives developed in personal darkrooms. The Leica in this portrait is thus not only attached to the photographer's hand, it is also attached to his creative process. A photograph of Van Vechten's apartment in New York City shows how he converted his living room into a studio space. The heavy curtain hanging on the right of the sofa could be pulled across the room in order to block out the daylight from the windows behind the sofa. Then, a model could take pose in front of the curtain illuminated by artificial lighting. Or, the cabinet door could be opened up to serve as a backdrop for an actor. To this basic setup, Van Vechten added a large selection of fabric curtains and asked his models to bring along costumes they might like to wear. As soon as he acquired his Leica, Van Vechten turned it on himself and invited friends in the arts and other celebrities to pose for him. He also played out his homoerotic fantasies using models as well as darkroom experiments. In the spring of 1938, the Indian dancer stepped into this space of photographic intimacy Van Vechten had created in his apartment studio. The Yale photographs are a result of a visual conversation between the photographer's racialized modernist sensibility and the dancer's ornamented, Sanskritized body, facilitated by the Leica between them. Within days after his photo shoot, while the dancer was still in New York, Van Vechten converted one of his photographs into a picture postcard to mail to the dancer, writing in the back, quote, "As a photograph, I think this is my favorite." It is worth speculating on why the photographer thought so. The low-angle shot celebrates the mobility of the handheld camera and pushes the boundary of intimacy it affords the photographer. For this close-up, Van Vechten must have unmounted his Leica from the tripod and held it kneeling down while the dancer looked at the lens inches away from his pelvis. Van Vechten's visual representations may seem exploitative to our post-colonial, post-orientalist eyes, but they would have pleased the dancer. They represent his body as an artwork and celebrate the spectacular array of pictographic forms he assumes in front of the camera. It may of course be true that the photographer's pictorial interests and the dancer's investments in these photographs may not be the same. In the Indian dance reform movement, Sanskritization was intended to minimize the sexual appeal of the dancer's body. And so, Ram Gopal's figurations lead me to ask, how does the Sanskritized body text become an object of erotic desire in these photographs? Several scenarios are possible. It may be, for instance, that dance in which the dancer's body is a spectacle on stage inherently contains an erotic charge, irrespective of the dancer's intentions. It may also be possible that a photograph in which the dancer's body is detached from the living space-time of the performance, turns the body into a sexual fetish, as Van Vechten's practice implies. Of course, a third possibility could simply be that in this space of transcultural interactions, the photographs represent one culture's body text lost in another culture's translation. I suggest one more possibility, however, namely that the dancer willingly presents himself as an erotic subject, as an erotic object. In his 1957 autobiography, Ram Gopal describes role-playing as part of his early training in Kathakali. He tells us that after a full day's strenuous practice of muscle and eye movements, his teacher usually summoned him to perform epic stories with him, saying, quote, "You shall be the beautiful maiden Damayanti, and I shall be your handsome prince Nala. And I want you to convince me by every look, gesture, and expression that you are truly, deeply in love with me." Unquote. Ram Gopal calls this a training in, quote, bewitching and enchanting himself. It is a bodily practice of going beyond his own gender and subjectivity and becoming an object of desire for his viewers. It is this technique of self-presentation that Ram Gopal now fully displays in front of Van Vechten's camera. So my next question is, how exactly does Ram Gopal bewitch and enchant himself for the American gaze? The program note for his New York concert hardly tells us about the body Ram Gopal may have presented to his American audience. But here, Van Vechten's photographs help. In them, we see the dancer molding his body into a proliferation of imaginative representations that freely interpret his dance training. Here, for instance, he displays what the program calls the picture of Bodhisattva. He holds a white lotus in his raised left hand, using mime to pluck the imaginary stem from his right hand, with his right hand. A contraposter turns his youthful body gently towards the androgyny of figures seen in ancient Buddhist sculpture of Southeast Asia and Nepal. The iconography departs from anything known in Ram Gopal's training in India. And here, we see him transforming himself into a feminine figure wrapped in transparent veil, borrowing possibly from the iconography of the compassionate Mother Guanyin, taken from Chinese Buddhism, or Salome, the veiled Roman seductress made popular in the 19th century in Orientalist painting, ballet, and modern dance. In 1938, Ram Gopal's New York audience would have been surprised by this representation of the Indian dancer. They associated Indian dance with the fame and prestige of Uday Shankar and his so-called Hindu ballet. A reviewer comments on the difference between the two dancers, writing, quote, "The gospel of Hindu dancing has been well preached by Uday Shankar and his cohorts, so that the gathering knew more or less what to expect in the nature of the choreographies. But the manner of Mr. Gopal's dancing, his remarkably fine muscular control, and his fascinating and exotic costumes must have won new converts to the cause." Unquote. As Joan Erdman points out, Uday Shankar choreographed group dances and insisted on the authenticity of costumes for his men and women by using Indian miniature paintings and colonial ethnographic photographs. By contrast, Ram Gopal danced solo and impressed his audience with a spectacular display of endlessly malleable forms shaped by an inventive series of unspecifiable costumes that depart from Uday Shankar's ethnographic representations. How to understand these costumes? It is possible that they are not Ram Gopal's own designs. A few months prior to his New York concert, Ram Gopal met an American dancer named Lameri, who was visiting Bangalore for a performance at the Opera House. Known for choreographing dance numbers borrowed from various world traditions, Lameri invited Ram Gopal to teach her the Kathakali, and join her on a tour of Southeast Asia and Japan, his first outside India. We see the two dancers posing against a temple in Java, both wearing costumes based not only on Southeast Asian sculpture, but also their Orientalist recreations in Hollywood films. Ram Gopal parted company with La Mary in Tokyo, and with 2 suitcases full of costumes, he traveled to Los Angeles and then to New York, dancing solo using tracks of pre-recorded music. The Van Vechten photographs not only document those costumes, but also show Ram Gopal experimenting with the Orientalist fantasies of Asia he may have picked up in La Mary's company. La Mary could have designed the broad beaded choker, the diadem, the short pleated skirt, and the armband the dancer wears. These ornaments derived from Egyptomania, a fad for Egyptian costumes and jewelry seen in American advertisements, dance, and Hollywood extravaganza in the early 20th century. In a 1910 cigarette advertisement, for instance, Ruth St. Denis, a dancer who inspired greatly La Mary, poses as a queen in an Egyptian hieroglyph. When La Mary visited India and met Ram Gopal in 1937, she was following Ruth St. Denis, who traveled to India and other Asian countries in the 1920s with her partner and husband Ted Shawn. Together, the couple choreographed dance numbers based on Asian religious traditions for their newly formed Denishon Dance Company. In 1938, Ram Gopal's costumes relate closely to this global network of American Orientalism in dance, film, and visual culture. Ram Gopal's costume may partly relate to the reformed Bharatanatyam dance in India. Designed by Rukmini Devi to replace the clutter of voluminous skirts and scarves of the dancing girls, the Bharatanatyam costume wraps closely around a dancer's body and lends her limbs and the dazzle of abstract linear patterns, emphasized by silk embroidery and sparkling ornaments. In Ram Gopal, we see a similarly aesthetic framing of the body. But while Rukmini Devi's costumes were meant to transform a female body into a visual abstraction, the aesthetic transformation was less visible in the male Bharatanatyam dancers, who continued in the ceremonial costumes of a male priest or a dance teacher, wearing a silk dhoti and perhaps a Brahmanical thread or a sash over a naked upper body. Ram Gopal uses the Bharatanatyam aesthetic impulse, but not the gendered paradigm of its design. Using costumes, ornament, and makeup, he develops the contours of his body into a linear abstraction and takes on fantastical appearances, partly also borrowing from American Orientalist dance and moving beyond the concerns for consistency and authenticity of dance in the reform movement. To Ram Gopal, combining Indian designs with American Orientalist tropes would not have seemed unusual to his dance training in India. The entanglement of Orientalist interests and Indian dance is clearly seen in one of the most prominent exponents of reform movement in India, namely the dancer Rukmini Devi, the wife of the British theosophist George Arundale in Madras. In 1930s, Rukmini Devi integrated an early training in the ballet and choreography based on Hindu mythology. She designed new costumes and staged dances within the compounds of the Theosophical Society, and she was soon to call her invention Bharatanatyam. The Theosophical Society, founded in New York City in 1875 by Henry Steele Olcott and Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, was one among many spiritualist groups spreading across Europe and America. These spiritualists studied occultism and Kabbalah and practiced vegetarianism as forms of resistance to Western industrial consumer culture. The Madras branch with Blavatsky established as an international headquarters became a destination for the study of Eastern religions within this network of global spiritualism. Many American dancers went to the Theosophical Society in Madras as part of a world network of alternative communities. Before her trip to India in the 1920s, for instance, Ruth Saint Denis visited an alternative community at Monte Verita in Ascona, Switzerland, where dancing in a natural landscape, individually or in a group, became not only a means for exploring the relationship between the human body and the rhythm of nature, but also a powerful symbol of human freedom from the industrial and commodity cultures of the West. To this sense of liberated body, Saint Denis added garments borrowed from Orientalist fantasies of Indian dancing girls. These global circuits of dance took roots in India with Rukmini Devi, who established an institution called the Kalakshetra in Madras in 1936 for training urban middle-class children in the Bharatanatyam dance. Her syllabus for the Bharatanatyam included vigorous rhythmic movements, modulated not only by Orientalist fantasies, but a study of Indian sculpture and Sanskrit texts in English translation, however, such as the translation of Abhinay Darpan of Nandikeshwara by the art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy called The Mirror of Gestures. Another important text at the Madras school was Kumaraswamy's volume, The Dance of Shiva, a volume of speculative essays published in New York in 1918 and read widely both in India and America. In fact, Ted Shawn became one of the first dancers to design a cosmic dance of Shiva for the Ziegfeld Follies in New York in 1928, inspired by an explicit connection Kumaraswamy makes in his volume between Indian dance and temple sculpture. During his visit to India 2 years prior, in 1926, Ted Shawn also became the first dancer to make a connection between the dancer's body and temple sculpture by ordering costumes and a wooden ring in Madras and posing against the Shore Temple in Mamallapuram in South India. Ram Gopal was not part of the Madras circle and probably was unaware of Ted Shawn's experiments in India, but he came of age just as these transcultural networks of dance were shaping the reform movement in India. Around the photoshoot, Ram Gopal gave a performance on May the 1st, 1938 at the 46th Street Theatre in New York City. The dance number we see listed in his program not only reflect his training, but a repertory including the dance of Shiva, the peacock dance, the cobra dance, and so on, from Orientalist dancers such as Ted Shawn and Ruth Saint Denis. In other words, as he introduces Indian dance to his American public, he also actively engages with American Orientalism. The picture of Bodhisattva listed in the program goes beyond Ram Gopal's training in the Kathakali or the Kathak. In the program, Ram Gopal makes an explicit connection between the Buddhist figure of compassion and a passage quoted from the Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita. The connection across two different religions in India is debatable, historically speaking, but it points to an essay published in Kumaraswamy's The Dance of Shiva volume entitled Cosmopolitan View of Nietzsche. In that essay, Kumaraswamy compares the Bodhisattva to Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch, Superman, and explains that both figures are self-realized heroes described in the Bhagavad Gita as, quote, superior to pity, resolute for the fray, but unattached to the results, who achieve inner freedom by going beyond one's bodily self and sensory desires. The Nietzschean vision is invoked many times in Ram Gopal's 1957 autobiography. Describing his early training in Kathakali, Ram Gopal writes that his teacher always insisted, quote, "You must become, you must concentrate and feel so intensely all I tell you that you are not conscious of the self. The self is forgotten, unimportant, small, of this world. But that other self, the God you are portraying, must come to life by sheer willpower and concentration. And this is possible only if you are completely lost in the rhythm of the moment." Unquote. The teacher's challenge reflects Kumaraswamy's essay and brings to dance training the exercise of willpower and self-realization discussed in the cosmopolitan view of Nietzsche. In front of Van Vechten's camera, Ram Gopal fully employs his teacher's instructions and produces in his body that other Nietzschean self through a proliferation of fantastical, gender-fluid representations. The dancer's art of taking on bodies literally makes him a pictorial man, as his American critic called him, except Ram Gopal might have preferred to call his pictorialized self a god. I suggest that these bodily transformations of the dancer are not simply ideological, but material. Posing in front of Van Vechten's camera, the dancer's body becomes what the filmmaker and theorist John Epstein calls photogeny. Epstein describes photogeny as a figure animated by the technology of the camera and the chemical properties of film. Writing in 1928, during the period of photographic experiments I call the Leica moment, Epstein illustrates his idea in stop-motion photographs used in scientific films to show the sprouting of a seed or a growth of crystal. It is as if the celluloid image reveals, through what he calls astonishing abridgments of time, an inner life of organisms, a life that exists in an altogether different temporality unknown to human perception. During the photo shoot, Ram Gopal is seized by the Leica moment. He is touched by it. Standing in front of Van Vechten's camera, he turns himself into a photogeny, a figure from a different temporality brought to life by the medium of photography. He would have been pleased to receive the picture postcard Van Vechten sent him of his favorite image days after the photo shoot. The low-angle view makes him appear monumental. The extreme close-up does another trick. It fragments his body and foregrounds the shiny ornaments which swirl like vegetation as if they were carved in relief on an Art Deco building. The photographic transformation brings to mind Walter Benjamin's response to Karl Blossfeld's photographic enlargements of plants in his 1928 publication Urformen der Kunst. For that great theorist of photography, Blossfeld's close-ups are not disorienting but revelatory. They reveal in the plants what Benjamin calls their organic stylistic forms, Stillformen. Quote, "In the crosier depicted by the fern, in the larkspur and in the blooms of saxifrage, we see forms reminiscent of the tracery in the rose window of cathedrals. In the greatly enlarged pictures of chestnut and maple shoots, we see pillars taking on the forms of horsetails and totems. The bud of the Eisenhoof unfold like the body of an inspired dancer." Unquote. For Benjamin, the enlargements are quintessential examples of what he calls new photography, which in 1928 can only mean what I have called the Leica moment. The Leica stirs in the dancer's body what Benjamin calls in Blossfeld the organic principle of life. The organic principle is entirely photogenic, in that it is the result of the camera and its precision lens and the trace of light on the chemical film. Only when the dancer's body is subjected to the Leica that it leaves a trace of its original stylistic form in these wonderful photographs. The photo shoot in New York has remained a marginal episode in the history of American photography as well as Indian dance. Ram Gopal never mentions it in his autobiography, and it is overlooked in the vast literature on Van Vechten. I find in these images, however, a compelling record of a brief moment when photography sparks a transcultural exchange across two separate domains of the Indian dancer and the American photographer. When Ram Gopal returns to India after his 1938 US trip, his dance undergoes a culture change. In a 1946 photograph you see here, we see him against a 12th century temple in Belur taking a virile pose of Bharatanatyam, not only representing his Sanskritized training, but also embodying a newly disciplined national cultural body text. In his book, Indian Dancing, published in 1951, Ram Gopal also claims that he is the first to perform in the Belur temple and thus revive an age-old tradition for the modern times. By mid-century, the national dance traditions are being documented and archived in India, and the history of Indian dance is written as an authentic and autochthonous classical form. In this period of archive formation, the photographs of Ram Gopal posing against a temple represents the classical dance of a newly emerging nation of India. Within this archival moment of Indian dance, the memory of earlier Orientalist recreations is completely erased. By mid-century, when Indian dance becomes authentic national tradition, Ram Gopal's experiments from just a decade earlier become all but forgotten. The Yale photographs literally disappear in plain sight when Indian dance becomes Indian. By mid-century, it will be impossible to imagine the androgynous figure morphing in front of Van Vechten's camera in the spring of 1938. That figure was a result of a nested series of transcultural fantasies for which both the photographer and the dancer fully exploit the possibilities of the Leica between them. In describing the transcultural interactions between the photographer and the dancer during the New York photo shoot, as an example of Orientalist fantasy making, I benefit from a recent turn in the vast literature on Orientalism. That literature examines not only the fascination with the Orient in Europe and America, but also what happens when the object of that fascination looks back. But while the return of the Orientalizing gaze is usually understood as an act of resistance or defiance by Asian practitioners, I find it intriguing that the Indian dancer's self-presentation is articulated through and not in opposition to the racialized erotic imagination of the American photographer. It is also important to note that the Orient of their shared fantasy is physically located in New York City and not in a place far away from the Western urban metropolis, as I had originally presumed when I first encountered the Indian dancer in the Yale archives. Finally, while we attend to the manipulations of the photographer and the dancer in these images, it is important, if somewhat counterintuitive, to recognize the Leica's own manipulation during the photo shoot. The Leica refocuses their Orientalist fantasies towards a fascination with the transformative powers of the photographic process. In other words, the Leica shifts their mutual interracial homoerotic interactions towards a sort of photoeroticism. During the photo shoot, both the photographer and the dancer begin to arouse the object of their imaginary desires inside the photographic image. It is only within a photoerotic threesome staged in the Leica moment that the pictorial man comes to life sui generis as a photogenic object of transcultural desires in these amazing photographs of the Indian dancer. Thank you.
so much, Ajay. There's so much in that, and we even got Madame Blavatsky as well, so that was quite something. But lots of questions. Usual thing, can you put your hand up? When I point to you, a mic is going to arrive. Don't give your question before the microphone arrives, because we will lose your question in there. And don't be shy about sticking your hand up.
Okay.
Who has a question? Yes.
Hi.
Speak really close to it. Put it really close to you.
Hi. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned there are two things that come to mind when I look at this. One is the parentage of Ram Gopal as being transcultural in the first place, and the identity formation that might have played a role in his Indianness or his national, his representative of nationalism. That's one. The other is both Kathakali and Kathak as dance forms stress a lot on the androgynous and on the fluidity of gender as dance forms themselves. So I'm just wondering whether there is more that the dancer is bringing to the table in terms of his dance training, because I don't think Ram Gopal was trained as a Bharatanatyam dancer. The training was predominantly Kathak and Kathakali, which are both.
I would argue that.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. So given the gender fluidity of both Kathakali and Kathak,
Right.
Is that playing a larger role than the photographer?
I think you're absolutely right on both counts. One is that I think his vision of India is quite different from what happens around the bit. Is this working?
Yeah, it is.
What happens to dance and culture at large around the middle of the century when nationalistic movement becomes the sort of lens to define dance as well as other cultural forms. He is thinking more about the transcultural already, and you know, his father was a Rajput from Western India who went to Burma as a lawyer within the British regime, marries a Burmese, and in his autobiography, which is he describes his childhood in Bangalore, but really talks a great deal about Burma and visiting the Buddhist temples and so forth. So he's always looking in some other direction. About dance, it is absolutely the argument to be made that there is something in Kathakali and Kathak, particularly speaking, where there is gender fluidity, and he does, and so. What happens by the middle of the century when dance archive is created, dance schools are established, and people are learning different dances as specialisms? One finds that Ram Gopal falls through this crack in that he does train disciples in the 40s in Bangalore. Later he settles in England, but those disciples who then become major dancers, or dancers he was dancing with, including great Bharatanatyam dancers like Mrinalini Sarabhai and so forth, in their memory, which is the memory of the mid-century, if you ask them what was Ram Gopal's training, the Kathak dancer, Kumudini Lakhya, for example, his student would say, probably Bharatanatyam, because he wasn't a very good Kathak dancer. Then Mrinalini Sarabhai, who's a Bharatanatyam dancer, the same question is asked. She said, Bharatanatyam, of course, but of course he wasn't such a good dancer. I was. And so this idea of Bharatanatyam sort of reformulates the memory of Ram Gopal. And in that Bharatanatyam moment, there's a clear separation between genders. And so when you think about, and so in the nationalistic moment, you find that there is a way in which gender differentiation happens. Scholars call this as this hyper-masculine moment when the dance, the image, ideal image of dance is of course great Shiva dancing, the masculine sort of dancer there and vigorous dance and so forth. But in terms of practice, it is clearly gendered. And Ram Gopal in that context doesn't quite fit. And his idea of Kathakali and Kathak even as masculine dance, he calls it a man's dance, but is not masculine in the nationalistic sense. It is the training of men to do gender bending or to play both men and women's roles. So excellent question.
Yes, question over here, and keep your hand raised so I can get to you.
I just really want to know if his tour of New York was a success. Like, does he get good crowds? Does it work, in other words, in a sort of...
It does, actually. And he's quite, the story is that he comes through a kind of a very well-controlled channel. He travels with this American dancer, but he's left back in Tokyo. The American dancer departs. He takes a boat with a friend to Los Angeles, heads straight to Hollywood, where he's schmoozing with Cecil B. DeMille, all that Orientalist filmmaker, and others. And he begins to perform there, and through those contacts gets a venue. And George Cukor, who is major producer, actually, I think, no, wait. The name is slipping my mind, but Sol Hurok, the great producer of dances for ballet and so forth in New York, takes him on and puts him on stage. And then there is John Martin and so forth, who are big critics in New York Times and so forth, that review him. He comes in contact with Van Vechten, and through that connection he travels to Europe. And he's performing in Paris, he's performing in Warsaw. In Paris, he's meeting an entire community of intellectuals. He goes to have dinner with Gertrude Stein, and so there is this kind of a movement. And he also comes back in 1948 to New York with this time a troupe, and he's representing the modern state of India and its dance in New York City. And then he also is invited to be a resident at the Jacob's Pillow, which is a big center of dance in Massachusetts in the U.S. So he moves about quite a bit.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of small questions. One of them is the background that he uses. In this background we have just plain curtain, but other parts of the background are hangings from Kutch to Katiawa. And it would be I'm wondering if there's another area that hasn't been explored, the collection of textiles from this period, because they look quite magnificent. Yeah. And then I was wondering about you talked of modernity, but in terms of ballet and dance, it looked different. I'm looking at this image that you have on the right, and that looks more like a Martha Graham piece of choreography than anything that comes from Indian dance, particularly this image. And other things look as if they've been very much influenced by Russian ballet.
Absolutely.
And this series with lighting, I think, shows a different idea, a totally different idea of modernity from the Man Ray look that you talked about. So these are just comments.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. The second question, really, that is the argument I'm making, that he's very open and picking up from a whole range of dance that relate to ballet. They relate to what I'm calling American Orientalist dance, modernist dance also, and I haven't quite done the research. I'm not a dance scholar of where he's getting this, because at this young age he's I don't know what he's exposed to. Bangalore, of course, is a cosmopolitan city in the 30s, and there may be many dancers who may be coming through that he must have picked from. So that is actually an important point to highlight, that some of this, what I'm calling transcultural kind of exposure, completely goes underground when, as I say, Indian dance becomes Indian. The costume idea is interesting because my sense is that it is where is that now? Sorry, to go back. It is as you can see right here. It seems he didn't bring costumes, so this is photographer's contribution. And he had a huge collection of fabric of different sorts that he layered. As you can see in the image on the left, there's a shiny fabric in the bottom, and this is an American Orientalist dancer, and then another fabric that you think seems to be like batik or something like that,
This is embroidery.
Embroidery? Okay, yeah. The fabric is a fascinating detail. It seems in New York there are several dealers of Orientalist fabric. There's one actually that reproduces a Persian miniature of the 16th century, but in a fabric, sort of large fabric. So I would be very interested to know what the connection would be. Some of the fabric that you see used for Ram Gopal also appear in later dates for other dancers and personalities in the African American movement that Van Vechten photographed.
Sorry, this is a very personal thing. I actually knew Ram very, very well. He presented me as a young dance phenomenon at the Victor Albert Museum Lecture Theatre. I have no.
I'm sorry. Can we? This is really fascinating, but we really. Can we just make sure that? Can you hold it really near you, and we'll see.
Can
if we,
you now? No, it's not working.
It cuts in and out. Okay, I'll tell you what. We'll see if we can get you another one. No, you have to turn it.
Use this.
It's just that with the.
You have to thank her for bringing me actually. Actually, I brought the photograph as well. So I have it doesn't work out.
Put back on the pedal.
Start speaking.
Yes. Now?
Yes, now good.
Right?
You need it quite close to that, and it needs to. It's technology. It's rubbish. Shout. It'll probably be better. But.
Probably you will hear me if I shout. I'm very good at shouting.
Okay.
I have no knowledge of this era of Ram at all. I knew him as a child, as a teenager in London, and he was, by the time I knew him, he was very well trained in the Pandinamdi style. He was based in London. I had a very disciplined ballet mama who made sure that Ram saw me dance, and that's where the connection started. So my debut in London was presented by him at the Victor Albert Museum Lecture Theatre, and he continued to present me for over 2 years. My last performance in London, he actually came in a wheelchair, and he took the veils off my feet. And so he taught me, even today, the critics all over the world have asked me, what was one of my greatest things that I learned, was what I learned from him, to project and to dance. There was a lot of Kathakali in his dancing, in his movement projection, But when I knew him, it was purely fundamental style. But he didn't teach me to dance so much as he taught me all the showmanship that he knew, which was, and I was very happy. I had some amazing people.
That's so
So I
great.
brought the poster to give it to you in case you want.
I would love to. I would love to see.
Thanks so much. It's fantastic to.
You have to thank you for dancing with me. She's the one who brought it to my attention.
This is great. This is really wonderful.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah. When I was in Bangkok.
Body. It's a real Gopal body here.
And he always said it's over 21. Never to ask him his age.
Yes, yeah, that's true. And when I was in Bangalore last fall, I was taken to meet a woman who was in her 90s, had dementia, who had danced with him in 1948 in London.
Yes, I think I know who you mentioned. I've never met her.
Bhanumati.
Yes, that's right. That's
Right. And she had dementia, but when I showed these photographs, her eyes lit up, and she was a Kathakali dancer. So she actually made sure that I learned the basic position, etc. And then really began to talk about that beautiful man, but his sexual interests were different.
There was a huge influence from both Woodstock Dennis and Martin in his projection of dance and the way he utilized the Indian dance movement.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. That's really good to know.
As I said, it's a personal input that I derived from him.
Thank you for that.
So we have two hands raised up. Let's go ladies first, and then over to Dr. Can we go back to the other mic and try? Hold on. Where is the other mic? Is it being chucked out as a bad job?
I can speak very
Okay, speak very loud then.
So I wondered if you could elaborate on the Leica moment that you described, and whether you see this the dynamic of this three-part dynamic of the photographer, the subject, and the camera as being unique to the photographer's relationship with this particular dancer, or do you see that present in the other photographs as well? Because it's interesting to consider the portraits of the Indian dancer. I find I was reading them quite differently when, as soon as I was confronted with the photographer's bigger collection, and yes, I just wondered about how that changes, how that changes a reading of the portraits of the Indian dancer when you take into account his whole collection, whether you see that Leica moment present in the entire collection.
Of Van Vechten.
Yeah.
I think the term that organizes this collection for me is Van Vechten's pursuing what I call photographic intimacy, and that is what Leica moment does. Leica is handheld, small camera. You could put it in your pocket, and so journalists took these photographs, to the streets, and it is mostly recognized as the ideal thing for street photography.
Yeah, that's why it's so strange.
And
because it's in a house in this very intimate, domestic space.
So my argument against that kind of thing is that that kind of people who talk about the genre of street photography and talk about how Leica created great journalists who could go all around the world, what they miss is the fact that actually the Leica could be pocketed. You could hide it here, and the intimacy between the photographer and the camera is obtained in all of the practices, but I think elaborated on in Van Vechten's studio, where he's actually developing that and taking it in the opposite direction, as opposed to the street photographers. He's taking it in this sort of interiority, and exploring sexuality, exploring, his own fantasies and darkroom experiments and so forth. So you see him digging this way.
So do you think that the work in itself would be considerably different had you been using another camera, for instance, that didn't, like a more formal camera?
Yeah, the visual quality, I'm not sure. Probably, I would argue, because it allows the precision lenses can help you take close-ups and so forth in a way you can't quite do with Kodak and so forth. And at that moment, and so I'm thinking that if you look at the Leica's practice in general, used by what I'm calling serious amateurs, in addition to the professional photographers, you see people focusing on what it can show that a normal camera can't show. So dentists use that to take real close-up of teeth, for example, or people who take themselves on zeppelins and take aerial photographs. It was used, of course, for war during the war quite heavily. So it was used by constructivists, by Bauhaus people who were trying to sort of, bring out a dimension of modern life that was probably more related to film rather than still photography. So I think there is something in what I'm calling the Leica moment that enables this kind of thought process and visual process that you don't see in an earlier moment. And connected to that are writers such as Epstein or Benjamin, who are actively writing about film and photography together and are theorizing about photography, like Walter Benjamin. And what is interesting about that is that while their theories are used by historians of photography to generalize about photography, Walter Benjamin's reflection on the daguerreotypes and so forth, what is missed in that entire literature is the moment in which they are writing. Their perceptions about optical unconscious or whatever would not have been possible if not for the Leica moment. That is my argument, that they're actually drawing their insights from this particular moment of 1928, 1930s, the moment in which they're writing and the moment in which Van Vechten is practicing.
Do you want to be patient? You may have to speak up.
I'll just speak up. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk, very useful material. But I was a bit worried about your problematization of kind of tripartite relationship between our positions from Orientalism through to post-colonialism, and somehow we all emerge in the transnational sublime. And I'm wondering whether you could be a bit more precise about that, because it seems to me that the transnational is both a denial of the relationship between between what you call Orientalism and post-colonialism, and an affirmation of it. The transnational is not some lovely place we all going to get to eventually if we wait for it. It's actually another mess which we haven't quite dissected.
I agree it's a mess, but I would say it's a good mess.
Desirable, yes.
And I would try to, so maybe that's a flaw in my thinking. One of the things I'm trying to do is to separate or distance myself from post-colonialism. In that it is post-colonialism when it looks at when it looks like at colonial archives, what they're looking for in the archive is a kind of a form of local resistance to transcultural forces, capitalist forces, colonial forces, things like that. And I'm not so taken by the idea of resistance in images, which is why when even Orientalists look at images like that and say, okay, this is the subject who now is looking back, and then begin to read it as a mode of claiming a certain photographic territory. I'm trying not to go there. What is interesting to me is that in fact there's a mutual collaborative fantasy making that is happening here, completely multiple, diverse, in that Van Vechten's interest might be very different from Ram Gopal's interests. And that multiplicity, that sort of contradictory mess, is what I'm calling transculturalism. And I'm interested in the trace of that in these photographs.
Yeah, just wondered if you could tell me a little bit more of what you know about the circulation or lack of circulation of the images. So I was quite struck by, on the one hand, I mean, I assume when we saw that one was turned into a postcard, this was a time when postcard sets were sold, and I didn't know whether the photographer did any of that, but sort of between the high art and the sort of pornographic homoerotic images you were showing. I also like, were they magazines or broadsheets? I mean, was he flogging these images or passing them around friends, or what was the go?
2-3 different things there. These photographs themselves were made in multiple copies but never circulated, which is interesting to me. Large size photographs. They all remained in Van Vechten's collection. They never appeared in Ram Gopal's repertory or as publicity photograph, none of that. So that's why I'm calling it a private sport. In terms of his own, what he did, Van Vechten did, is to create postcard size images on his own. And apparently has a stamp, as you might see, that you could simply stamp in the back. And that was, it seems, a practice quite commonly held at that point. So not sold as postcards the way we might think of them, but simply as little note cards that you can put a postage stamp and say, send it as a thank you note to the...
Like seasonal stationery.
Yeah, and you could say, last night was lovely, but the pea soup wasn't as good, which is what, some of the things I've seen in these photographs. It was still a kind of a circulation of that kind. He also did one more thing, which is to make picture postcard size sets and put them in a kind of a shoebox to give to as sets to friends in the dance companies or friends in the Harlem Renaissance and so forth. And some of them have appeared on the market as a set later on, but really very personal sets. For the scrapbooks, and there are about 20 of them at the Yale's Beinecke Rare Book Collection, that was completely private. And he picked images, hardly used his own images. It was mainly clippings from here and there, and then sentences from printed, media, newspaper and so forth, that he was very good at catching homoerotic kind of tone in them, or sort of misconstrue them that way. And in fact, that collection, that side of the collection, this very, very private collection, he had made in his will a kind of a caveat that they not be released until 20 years after he died. So he died in 1964. In mid-80s and early 90s, there was suddenly a huge burgeoning of scholarship on his erotic imagery.
Yeah, you can see why those interested in the history of, 60 subcultures of gay men taking photographs of each other or filming each other, you could see why that would be of enormous interest, because there's a link between two different periods. I mean, that's going to be my question. What is this practice and subculture comparable to what is another, who else was doing this? Who else was rigging up their East Side homes and putting curtains up and taking a lot of intimate pictures? I mean, is there any practice that you have compared Van Vechten to, or that might be comparable to it?
It seems that there were a lot of professional photographers, but he never, and he always looked at them. He was as a regular writer for the Vogue and so forth. He was very much aware of photographers. And later in the 60s, he writes a statement where he's saying, "Oh, I knew all these photographs taken, and Man Ray and so forth." But he never exhibited. He never saw himself as a photographer, which is why this idea of an amateur is interesting to me. He seems to be well connected with artistic circle, but mostly was seen as a kind of a socialite. So there are lots of references in his novels in particular, and he wrote about 6 or 7, are all about getting together and having parties and things like that. And so this intimacy, places where then he's able to invite people from the Harlem and somebody from his own circle in Upper West Side and so forth, seems to be the kind of lifestyle. Within that, if somebody picked up photography,
well, I suppose I meant the whole contraption of the homoerotic bonds, the dress up, the photograph. I mean, if you put it all together, is it something that you can equate to, I'm sure in the 80s they read it as a kind of proto-Warholian practice, or, or, with people taking long films of each other doing strange things. But that may not be the most appropriate link, but
that is very true. And in fact, that's what sort of I'm trying to distance myself from, because in the moment of the 60s, 80s, post-Stonewall and all of that, and gay rights and so forth, and Robert Mapplethorpe, and one finds that there is this huge, and then huge interest in seeing where else. And the literature you see on Van Vechten is therefore cast in the terms of the 1980s. The idea of the closet, for example, which is, I would say, a 1980s invention. And one of the things I'm struggling with is to sort of look back at the 30s, where there seems to be a kind of a multiplicity of sexual encounters that were possible, at least in the metropolitan cities like New York and Chicago, that seemed to be, unlike closet, more like an open secret. Everybody knew, and they were married, but so what? Kind of a sense that you find in that particular moment. So there were painters who painted in that moment. There were, I would imagine, practitioners in the arts, writers who were writing and so forth. So I'm trying to look at the 30s as 30s rather than the 80s played out before the 80s. Yeah.
Could I just make one addition to that? And I'll shout out too. Did you see the photographs by Van Vechten that were done for the opera Four Saints in 3 Acts? Because there was an exhibition, and there's a small publication done by the Photographers Gallery in London. I was lucky to see it. So some of the other photographers one of the other photographers, which gives you the clue, was George Platt Lyons. But the others were Lee Miller, and someone I don't know called Therese Bonney. And so there were 4 of them who photographed. But the connections were with people like Gertrude Stein and with Virgil Thompson. So there's the gay, the very out, I agree, totally out gay bohemian.
Right.
Transatlantic.
Right.
Culture. Mm-hmm. And then there's, this looks very much like amateur theatricals to me. Right? So it's kind of like a house tradition of amateur theatricals and making what they used to call, as we recall, tableau.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Great.
I think it fits into those ones. But that little publication is a killer.
Yeah. Okay. I will take that reference after we finish doing it. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, we're getting towards the. If there's a really quick, brief last question, please ask it now. And if not, I want to say a very big warm thanks to Ajay for a very stimulating session. Thank you all for your questions and memories and personal testimonies. It's been great question and answer session. Thank you all very much for coming, and don't miss next semester's episodes. I think.